Okay, well, are we all aboard? Okay. And then I don't say, it's going to be a bumpy night. But travel today can be disarmingly easy and amazingly fast. May not be all that comfortable, but we can certainly get places fast in ways that we couldn't before. As Oregonians, most of us are probably familiar with tales of the Oregon Trail, immigrants in covered wagons pulled by oxen, trekking from the Missouri to the Willamette Valley. Crossing the continent in the 1840s took about 6 months. Today, you can drive it in 27 hours or so, Google says, or maybe 3 hours jammed in an airplane and 3 hours at the airport as well. In 1869, 150 years ago, in fact, it'll be 150 years ago exactly on May 10th, a railroad reached San Francisco Bay from the Missouri River. And suddenly, a 6-month trip by land took 6 days. By 1891, a trip from Portland to Chicago took only 4 days and 4 nights. Only. The railroad network from Chicago, St. Louis, New Orleans, spanned the miles to Los Angeles, to the Bay Area, to Puget Sound and Portland. And that sprang up by the end of the 1880s. And from that time until the 1960s, if you traveled from the West Coast to the Midwest and the East, you probably did it by train, and it was over one of 6 major railroad company lines that extended from the Midwest to the West Coast. I'll briefly tell you about those, and we're going to go through the dining car experience on those by the company. So the first one to come across was the Northern Pacific, which connected Chicago and the Twin Cities with Portland and Puget Sound across central Montana. Another line that was paralleling that was the Great Northern, ran from St. Paul, Minneapolis to the West Coast, but a bit north and through Glacier National Park. Third line was the Union Pacific, which went from Omaha west to Denver, Salt Lake, and then there were lines from there to the west, to the northwest to Portland and Seattle, via the Southern Pacific, direct west to San Francisco and south to Los Angeles. Another northern route was the Milwaukee Road, which paralleled the Northern Pacific through the Dakotas and Montana to Puget Sound. Fifth line was the Santa Fe that went from Chicago to Kansas City and then throughout the Southwest to California and New Mexico and Arizona. And finally, the line that you probably know if you've lived in this area for a while, the Southern Pacific, which not only had lines that went up and down the coast, Portland to the Bay Area and LA, but also from California to the east and to El Paso and New Orleans in the south. Well, we're talking about long trips, and it's one thing to hop the Amtrak Cascades to Seattle and grab a sandwich on the way. But when you're traveling 4 days, 4 nights, 3 days, 3 nights, you may not be able to carry the fried chicken with you from home, and you may not feel that you can jump off the train at each time you're hungry and grab something to eat. Well, so you could bring your own, or you could buy food from vendors who often were down at the station in the 19th century with a tray of sandwiches or fruit and so on. And you could bring your own. I remember my grandma talking about going back to Minnesota and taking indeed fried chicken for the first day. But oranges and apples and things from then on. So the railroad companies established meal stops. Go back here. Just in case you're wondering, have you guys seen these rocks? Have you been up I-84 on the Columbia River Gorge? You go right past them. They don't look so big now, but they are. And when the Union Pacific and the Northern Pacific ran their line down the Columbia, it went right between these two pillars, which are known as the Pillars of Hercules or the Needles. They're just east of Troutdale, a few miles near Rooster Rock. So the railroad company, established meal stops. Now this is an illustration of how badly Americans ate in the 19th century, because like today, they gulped their food and they crowded into places that dolloped them food at a fast rate and full of nice carbohydrates and fats. And but this was a harried way to eat, and the railroad companies really didn't want to get much involved in it, although some of them did. So you found meal stops like this. This is a picture of Aurora. Aurora, you may know of as it was founded as an agricultural communal colony, a Christian sect that became noted in Oregon not only for their unusual practices, but also because they made great food. For years, they had a famous stall at the state fair that sold food. And they also established a meal stop along the railroad line. Even though it's only an hour's ride from Portland, if you got on the evening train out of Portland in the 1870s, you stopped for dinner at Aurora. And coming up into Portland, you stopped at Aurora for lunch. And this is a painting that shows the train station on the right and the hotel where you got your dinner at the left. And here we have a picture postcard advertising one of these meal stops in the Blue Mountains of of Oregon, at the little town of Meacham. And it was, for a while, run by a woman known as Grandma Moses, or Grandma Munra. Grandma Moses painted this picture. No, this is Grandma Munra. She also, for a while, ran a meal stop near Bonneville, and she became well enough known that there were articles about her in the Oregonian. She was quite the hostess. And there is a Munra Falls and a Munra Ridge in the Columbia River Gorge named for her. But she ran this meal house called the Log Cabin at Meacham for some years. And there were other railroad eating houses that you could find along the line at Ashland, at Albany, and Bonneville. But these kinds of stops added a lot to the time it took to travel. And people were already concerned about how long it took. Now that we've speeded everything up so much, we still want to save more. And that was to actually feed people while they're on the train. That's the easy way to do it. Easy, but not cheap, and not cheap to buy, and not cheap to stock, and not cheap to operate. And they were very expensive to staff and provision them. None of the Western railroads were eager to put on dining cars, but there was a demand. Still, the railroad companies, quietly on the sly, conspired to agree not to have dining cars. If you don't have them, then I won't have them, and none of us will have to buy this expensive stuff. But as usual, agreements like that don't hold, and the Northern Pacific was the first to breach it. This is an artist's view, which makes the car look very expansive and rather church-like. Thanksgiving time on the Northern Pacific. Notice the icicles up at the top. And everybody looks very well dressed and very much behaving themselves at this, in this fine edifice on wheels. And the turkey on the left, yes. Sorry, I had to cut a little of him off. But so this company's main line ran from St. Paul to Portland and Puget Sound through cars from Chicago. And it made dining cars a key feature of their advertising. Here's an advertisement in early color version. Again, making the ceiling look considerably higher than it really was. And with a white-coated black waiter performing the service, and the what's on the table looks pretty snazzy. And here's one of their advertisements from the 1890s, and you notice that they make a point of saying it is the dining car route, composed of dining cars unsurpassed. So they are using food as a way to entice you to ride their line rather than any of the other options you might have to go to Chicago or DC or wherever. For many decades, the Northern Pacific's premier train was called the North Coast Limited. And here's a photo of it outside Portland at a time when going from the original Northern Pacific line took you from Seattle south to Portland and then up to Spokane. And at the time this was running, well, the Northern Pacific ran their train. This is going out of Portland, headed for Seattle, en route from Chicago. So not only did Northern Pacific push how magnificently high-ceilinged and beautifully appointed their dining cars were, but also how healthful they were. So Dr. Harvey Wiley, you might or might not remember, but once back when I was a kid, there was a postage stamp issued to Dr. Wiley on the 50th anniversary of the passage of the 1906 Food and Drug Act that finally brought some idea that government might have a role to play in making sure you didn't eat food that was going to harm you. We're still working on that. But Dr. Wiley was a pioneer in that. So he was saying the right kind of food was available on Northern Pacific. Well, one of those right kinds of foods the Northern Pacific foisted on us was the great big baked potato. Not just an ordinary great big potato, but a big one, which was found, of course, in Washington State, not Idaho, and certainly not Maine. So there's a story behind how they happened to pick up on this as an advertising, gimmick. But initially, they required each potato to weigh at least 2 pounds. So potatoes were featured in Northern Pacific advertising, like this postcard, where you see a pile of potatoes, here called Murphy's, because Murphy's an Irish name and potatoes are Irish. And you see a dollar, a silver dollar, and a 12-inch ruler to show you how big these great big potatoes really are. This is why the Smiths left home and traveled by the Northern Pacific Railway, because they could get these potatoes. And they even put out menus that emphasized potatoes. This is a potato-shaped menu. And keep harking back to Dr. Wiley, there is a healthful apple, too. That was also a menu that folded out. Inside was the menu. Well, of course, the railroad not only served potatoes in the dining car, they also shipped potatoes. And so potato shippers and potato eaters and loyal Washington State boosters all found a reason that maybe they should take the Northern Pacific rather than the Great Northern or the Union Pacific on their trip east. And apples, of course, were another feature that benefited from advertising by Northern Pacific. And as you can see from these colorful examples, it was the case that the dining car steward would happily give you a souvenir menu to take home or to send to your Aunt Mildred in Bemidji, Minnesota. And they would even mail these for you. Northern Pacific was also noted for its seasonal fruit cakes, dark fruit cakes and light fruit cakes. And in holiday season, you could not only buy them and eat them on board, but you could tell the steward to please mail one to Aunt Mildred in International Falls or wherever. And again, this was a good advertising gimmick to do. And this is another example of a souvenir menu that Northern Pacific did. For years, they used scenic photographs on one side of their menu card. This is one by the famous Seattle photographer Asho Curtis, and shows a lake in Idaho. And on the back, you see the actual menu. I don't know, you probably would have a time reading the actual items on there, but excuse me. We'll see some other examples coming up. Now, if you were traveling west in a group, which was a frequent occurrence in the early 20th century, you might have a special menu prepared for you. This is a souvenir menu from a group of subscribers to the magazines New England Homestead and Ohio Farmer. They were probably traveling and they were apparently signed up to go on a cruise in Alaska. So this is the kind of thing that organizations and magazines would often put together a tour. And Northern Pacific not only provided the transportation, but gave them these souvenir menus about that leg of their trip from Indianapolis or Concord, New Hampshire to Alaska back in the 1930s. So virtually all the Western railroad lines produced dining car menus that were meant to be souvenirs and advertising. This wasn't true in the South and the East, but in the West it was a big deal. So going on to one of their major competitor lines, the Great Northern Railroad, they too used souvenir menus. This is a beverage menu from the Great Northern just before Prohibition kicked in. On the bottom, you can't read it, but it says, "We won't serve any liquor in North Dakota or Idaho because they've already opted out of liquor. The Prohibition is statewide. And they won't sell any liquor in Washington State on Sundays. And they won't sell any liquor at stops on railroad stops on Indian reservations because the federal government didn't want Indians to have liquor. And just to top it off, in Minnesota, you couldn't buy or sell cigarettes. Iowa also banned cigarettes. And you could take all that information with you. The wine list there is a lot more than wine. There are lots of after-dinner drinks and things. A little bit of wine, and a little bit of it's from California, but wine was not something that was thought to be American, so we don't show too much of it there. And a lot of cigars and a few cigarettes. So the Great Northern at one time also promoted, of all things, the eating of reindeer meat. Now, reindeer are not indigenous to Canada or Alaska, but they're similar to caribou. And so the Lohman brothers in Nome, Alaska, brought over a bunch of reindeer from Northern Europe and started raising them in Alaska. Well, after you've raised a bunch of reindeer, what do you do with them? Well, you slaughter them and you try to sell them somewhere else. So they were exported, and this is the cover of a little booklet that the Great Northern published and handed out to their passengers of recipes for reindeer meat, which you could buy at Seattle's famous Pike Place Market, for example. This shows an Alaska reindeer meat stall in the 1920s. I'm wondering what's going on in that lower right corner there, if the white smocked butcher is handing out free samples of reindeer jerky or something. But there it is. However, the Great Northern met resistance from some of their customers, cattle ranchers, who shipped their animals to market on the railroad. And they said, you know, you're going to push this stuff and not our beef. So the reindeer disappeared. The Great Northern, like the Northern Pacific, also got on the health foods kick, and their menus featured health cakes as well as hot cakes, so with more healthful grains in them. Another promotional idea is shown in this Great Northern breakfast menu from the 1930s during National Dried Fruit Week. And so it's stamped at the top there, National Dried. There were, as there still are, a lot of industry-sponsored, National Pie Day, PI and PIE, and there are national this and national that's. As I have a wonderful picture postcard of National Canned Salmon Week display with piles of canned salmon, which was the cheap tuna fish of its day. So the regular menu here includes things like dried figs with cream, steamed plums, which of course are prunes. There's a lot of fruit on there, and of course this is fruit country out here. The Wenatchee apple is mentioned in particular. Melon, grapefruit, canned pears, apple, prune, pineapple, and grape juice, lemon and orange marmalade, strawberry preserves, wild blackberry jam. So they really went all out in promoting those kinds of local products. And of course, to encourage you again to carry off your menu, remember your trip, and come back again, these very graphically colorful menu covers are from Great Northern also. The one on the right is a delight to people who look for examples of good graphic design. The Empire Builder was the name of Great Northern's premier transcontinental train. It's still used as a name by Amtrak. And the Indian portrait on the left was done by a man named Wynald Rice, who in the 1930s and 40s and 50s was quite well known for his artwork of Native Americans. It was highly collectible. So Great Northern put his work on menus and calendars and posters, and that's why I happen to have one. Somebody said, that's a neat picture, let's hang on to it. So let's move to the Union Pacific Railroad, which was part of that first transcontinental line in 1869. They operated from the Midwest to Ogden, Utah, where the Central Pacific, which later became Southern Pacific, took the train on to the Bay Area. And of course, eventually to LA and Los Angeles and Portland and so on. Like the Northern Pacific, they jumped into the fray and got dining cars. Now they put up a very impressive artist's illustration again of how elegant and high-ceilinged and lavishly appointed our cars are. And so in the 1890s, they began carrying dining cars. And sometimes they were not operated by the railroad themselves, but by another company, the Pullman Company. If you're as old as I am, you may remember the name Pullman. Pullman was a company that operated sleeping cars. And on almost all railroads, Pullman ran the sleeping cars separately from the railroad company. They also, for a time, would also undertake to provide you with a dining car, and Union Pacific used that. So that's why you see the Union Pacific logo here, but it's a Pullman dining car. And that's supposed to be Mount St. Helens there in the picture. And inside, here is a breakfast menu from the 1890s. When the whole breakfast, this was what we would call a table d'hôte service. You pays your money and you get the full meal. You get to pick certain items in the courses. But this is a mini-coursed breakfast. And it costs 75 cents. That's it's close to $20 today. So it was not a cheap breakfast. On the other hand, what you got your oatmeal and cream, you got fish, you got some meat dishes, then you got the main dish, which might be broiled steak. Then there's quail on toast, and then there's eggs, and then there's potatoes, and then there's beverages and bread. So you will not go away hungry, and you probably should get off the train at the next stop and run around the platform. About 20 years later, the 19-teens, this is a Union Pacific subsidiary, the Oregon Washington Railroad and Navigation Company. And this shows a dinner menu. Here the menu is a la carte. You pick each item and pay for it separately. So from this list, this menu, if you picked an oyster cocktail, a cup of soup, a beef tenderloin steak, some peas, bread and butter, ice cream, and coffee, cost would have been $1.90. That's about $47.80 today. So this is not something everybody on the train went to go and do. But of course, if they did decide to go, they might just have the cup of soup and the bread. And you could do that, you could buy separately. This card also advertises Portland's famous Bull Run water. And that was another feature that some railroads did. The Southern Pacific, for example, in Northern California, passes right by some springs in the Sacramento River Canyon, and Shasta mineral water was served on Southern Pacific trains. And this menu, too, at the bottom says, just let me know if you want to mail this off to Aunt Mildred, because we'll do it. And here's another Union Pacific menu from the 1920s, just to show you how this kind of thing would end up tacked on some kid's wall. Mom might stick up the picture next to the kitchen sink, just a reminder of the time that she went to Yosemite. In 1930, Union Pacific Railroad introduced a through Chicago to Portland train called the Portland Rose. That was a name they actually used clear up until creation of Amtrak in 1971. Now, this souvenir postcard shows you a lot of the rose elements. It's woven into the carpet. There are fresh roses on the tables. There are roses painted above the windows. And the dining car china has rose pattern on it as well. And presided over by a white-jacketed black waiter and a black-jacketed white steward who was in charge of them, and all pictured with shiny white linen on every table there. During the 1930s, whoops, did I miss one? Nope. Sorry, I'm trying to remember which, does A come before B or, anyway. These again are some of the souvenir menus that Union Pacific ran in the 1950s and 60s. You see Corrales being pictured on one of those, upper right. View from the Vista House in the Columbia Gorge. View of sailing on San Francisco Bay. And again, these were meant to be and were taken as souvenirs. During the 1930s, when the Depression kind of cut down on everybody's travel, whether by car, train, plane, or anything, the Union Pacific did some experimenting with streamlined and diesel-powered trains. They were innovators in that field. And this is a menu from one of their early streamliners, the City of Portland. They also had one called the City of Los Angeles in the 30s. And both of those trains ran only several days a month. You had to get reservations, and they cost extra. And they offered a fast schedule, 2 nights and 1 day between Chicago and the West Coast. So that's pretty fast. In fact, we barely manage it now. Trains are now slower. Okay, so for a while they offered the streamliners offered a French cuisine dinner. If you reserved in advance for $1.75, that's about $30 in today's money. So it's not actually quite as extravagant sounding as some of those earlier ones, but it's the Depression and prices were falling. So this Frenchy dinner actually is still very much in line with what Union Pacific was feeding people in general, which was a lot of beef, and because it's the West Coast, salmon. So you find that pattern of beef and salmon being a Union Pacific feature for these many decades. In the 1950s, some of the Union Pacific streamliners became dome liners because they had glass domes or bumps on the top of some of the cars, which allowed you to have a panoramic view of the countryside. And at the same time, they had some other innovations. Excuse me. These postcards, again, souvenir handouts, show the dining in the gold room, which was a room you could reserve for private parties. So your own birthday party on board the train, whatever. And then the bottom shot is of the main dining car area with 1950s snazzy seating arrangements. I read recently that these gold-plated flatware there that you see at the top proved to be exceptionally appealing to thievery, to thieves, and they didn't use it very long because it got stolen even more often than their usual silver plate. And I know that was stolen too because I had some. I didn't steal it, but I have some. And there was also dome seating in a dining car on some Union Pacific trains. Now that really gave you the all-out look-around sensation of sitting in a quiet space up in the air, eating your beefsteak and watching the wonders of the western scene go by you. I have to say I never got to eat in a dome dining car, and I regret it. Too late now. And here's a Union Pacific menu from the centennial of the first completion of the first transcontinental railroad. And as I say, the 150th is coming up in 2 months. So they put out special souvenir menus in 1969 for that centennial. So Union Pacific that we just looked at was the pioneer in traveling out west on the railroad. One of the latecomers was the Milwaukee Road Railroad. The full official name just kind of rolls off your tongue. The Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul and Pacific Railroad Company. They completed their line between Chicago and the Puget Sound in 1911. And so they had already were facing a field of competitors in that market. And they tried to make their service somewhat distinctive. They hired a celebrity chef in the 1920s, George Rector, who his father had founded, and he carried on a restaurant in New York City called Rector's that was a resort for the well-to-do and the elite. And so he served as a consultant on menu development and so on for the Milwaukee Road. And they featured him in ads, as they do here. And also had a cookbook published. The Rector Cookbook came out as a book, and then a number of copies were given a special embossed cover with the Milwaukee Road logo on it. And those cookbooks were handed out to special patrons. And this is an interior view of a Milwaukee Road dining car in the after World War II in the 1940s. And again, you see that here we've made the ceiling look taller by getting outside the car and looking down on it. Unusual table seating arrangement. Notice the triangular table for two. Almost all railroad dining cars then and now were four-seaters. And the reason is, of course, that you want to cram in as many people as you can because you've got limited time and limited space to feed a whole bunch of people. And so one of the traditions, like it or not, was that the steward might seat you and your wife, say, at a table with two strangers. And you'd say, how are you doing, where are you going, etc. And you were forced to make acquaintance whether you wanted to or not. I've been on dining car rides with people who took an immediate dislike to that idea and refused to be seated with certain people. Very unsettling experience. But here everybody is friendly, but there's also a table for two available. So again, that was a nod to trying to be a little different from the other companies. And we'll move on to the Santa Fe, or another rolling name, the full name, the Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe. These are a couple of advertising brochures from the Santa Fe, which, like some other railroads, had invested a great deal in good graphic arts work. And these are really very dramatic pieces of the printers and the graphic artists' design. So the Santa Fe, which came from Chicago and went down into the Southwest, Texas and New Mexico, the Grand Canyon. In the 1870s, they began dealing with an entrepreneur named Fred Harvey, who was operating hotels and restaurants. And Santa Fe began having him open up online hotels and restaurants, which would serve as meal stops and also places for traveling salesmen and so on to stay. And when they decided to carry dining cars, they hired the Fred Harvey Company to operate the cars on the train for them. The Chief and the California Limited were two of those trains. Some of their lesser trains, the ones that those so-called milk trains or mail trains that stopped at every little hamlet, still were using stops for meals at Fred Harvey houses clear through World War II. But the finer trains all carried Fred Harvey dining cars. Here are a couple of menus, one from the early 1900s and another one from 1937. The Chief being one of their main trains. When they went to experimenting with streamlined trains and such folderol in the 1930s, they called their upgraded, runs a few times a week, extra fare, extra special train, the Super Chief. And the Super Chief in the 1940s and 50s was the favored train of movie stars and would-be movie stars traveling between LA and New York. And so this Super Chief menu has a pretty fancy list of offerings, starting off with Hearts of California artichokes, again that local reference, and caviar. Let's start things off with caviar, dear, and champagne, of course. But it's really a very exclusive menu for people who thought they were very special. Santa Fe, whoops, yeah. Okay, yeah. In its later years, the Super Chief it didn't have a dome dining car, but it did have a special turquoise room, again, that was available for you and your special loved ones to have your own private dinner served up to you. So you could be really living, as it says here, on the Super Chief if you could rent out the turquoise room for dinner one night. Yeah, I missed this one. This is Santa Fe was another company that did a wonderful job of putting fabulous bits of artwork on its menu covers. The Santa Fe Railroad itself had a collection of Southwestern art, or Southwestern related art, that became quite famous. There are a couple of books about their art collection. And so they featured a number of things from their collection on their menus. E.I. Coos was an artist who did a lot of paintings, especially of Native Americans and other scenes around Santa Fe, and is now, he's a very pricey man. I walked into a gallery once and I thought, oh, that's a Coos painting. Yes, it could be yours for $450,000. Oh, it's very nice. Why don't you keep it a while? And finally, we'll go on to a company that may be familiar to you, the Southern Pacific, because it ran to Corvallis, ran to Quina City on the coast. I'm afraid no dining cars ran through Philomath. No dining cars ran through Corvallis either. But they did run through Albany, a lot of them. So the Southern Pacific had routes from San Francisco eastward over the Sierras, from LA to El Paso, and from there to New Orleans and the Midwest, and all up and down the coast, from Portland to California, clear down to LA. It was a gigantic company at its height. In 1926, for example, it was the second largest corporation in the U.S. in terms of revenue. Of course, the top 10 revenue makers in 1926, 5 of those 10 were railroad companies. Southern Pacific in 1926 employed 96,000 people, operated more than 100 railroad dining cars, as well as serving food at station restaurants, on several steamships, and aboard a whole fleet of more than 24 ferry boats on San Francisco Bay. The food service workers, chefs and cooks, the waiters, the dishwashers, were African American, as they were on most American railroads. The stewards, their supervisors, of course, were white. Here we have a smiling cook on a special issue of the Southern Pacific Employees magazine. This issue was all about Southern Pacific's food service in the 1920s. Like the Milwaukee Road, Southern Pacific had a celebrity chef. His name was Paul Rice, but he was more than just a consultant. He was an SP employee for many years, and they used pictures of him and his name and his recipes in a lot of their advertising, including these free recipe booklets that they distributed for many years. And there's Paul Rice on the left. And on the right, we have a cook tossing up a salad there. And of course, SP suggested you carry off their menus too, and they used a variety of things. Here's a very romantic looking menu cover. The front cover on the left shows a pensive couple apparently thinking about the past in the upper panel there, looking at the glorious old days of Mexican California. And another picture was on the back of the menu. And this menu from the 1940s was for the San Francisco Overland Limited, one of the major trains between the Bay Area and Chicago. And if you look and squint just right, you see covered wagons and old miners and some cowboys and Indians shooting at each other in that kind of cloud of smoke over the locomotive. Southern Pacific dining cars made a feature of California vegetables and fruits. California was the land of beautiful things. And for many years, Southern Pacific boasted of the salad bowl. Each table got a bowl of salad, green salad. And if it got empty, it got filled again. So you always had plenty of salad. The company also had, and this is unusual for Western railroads because beef was always the big thing, not only on the railroads, but in most homes and restaurants and so on. But in 1930, Southern Pacific offered on its menu a lamb casserole, which somehow took off. And by 1937, the lamb casserole was the big hit on Southern Pacific, their best seller. They averaged the average consumption of lamb per month in 1937 was 56,572 pounds. So at least for a while there, lamb was considered good stuff to eat. Southern Pacific introduced two streamlined trains between Portland and San Francisco through Albany, the daytime Shasta Daylight, and the overnight train, the Cascade. So here you have pictured a souvenir postcard at the top from the Shasta Daylight showing their tavern area, the bar or lounge, with fancy seating arrangements. And on the bottom is a brochure about the Cascade's 3-unit dining car. This was three cars long, but connected by an articulation so that there was a swivel between the cars. So it was a very long unit with a kitchen at one end and a dining area in the middle, and on the other end, a lounge or a bar car for drinks and so on. And it was called the Cascade Club. This is a menu from 1955, and the menu features the salad bowl and even a modest wine list. It's all California. This is a surprise. Well, maybe not for Southern Pacific, but for most railroads, advertising California wine was like saying, well, the cheap stuff. So, but Southern Pacific did take that on, did promote wine at a time that, in the 50s, for example, when the wine was not exactly a hot seller. Alas, by the early let's see, I'm going to go on to this one here too. This is another set of two menus. The 2 pages on the left are from one of those kinds of let's all get together and travel menus. Special train tour deluxe of the National Association of Retail Grocers from Los Angeles to Portland. This is probably a group of several sleeping cars that was going up to Portland and then would be taken east on a different railroad to the Midwest, and then the cars might be split off with maybe one car to Atlanta and a car to New York and a car to Washington, D.C. But this meant that the grocers who had been lured all the way out west to a conference could get back with a slight savings in cost, but adding some time to see the sights. As long as you're going to go all the way to LA, you might as well see Mount Shasta, etc. And so, again, a special event, and this kind of thing would be done to give you a special souvenir. The menu card on the right is overprinted it says Warner Brothers Special en route from Chico. That's probably a chartered train, or at least a part of a train, for a group from Hollywood who was probably doing filming in Northern California and heading back to LA. By the early 1960s, Southern Pacific was one of those railroads that was very unhappy about how much it cost to carry passengers according to their counting versus how much money they got. And so they began trying to totally eliminate dining cars. Their worst attempt here was something called an automat car in the early days of microwave and automatic buffet cars. So it declined to that. Cans of soup. I once tried to eat something on one of these cars, and you had to open your own can of heated up soup. Isn't that fun? It's already heated. You can't hold on to it to make it open. It was pretty awful. So things maybe have gotten better. They have a good chance to go worse again too. But so here's a more contemporary Amtrak Cascades dining car. You buy your food in one car and you take it to another where there is seating with nice lights and can put a smile on your face even if you're looking out at bridge abutments. Where's the scenery? It's out there somewhere. So from the heights to the depths, from touting fresh apples and California oranges to touting microwave canned beef stew, dining on the train has always been something of an adventure, combining travel and moving, having a view, along with food and drink, and sometimes good food. James Beard, back when he would have been in his about 12 years old, talks about traveling on the Southern Pacific train to California in the early 1900s and how wonderful the food was, although it was a little better on one steamship line. So today you can still eat on a train, and if you travel on the right train at the right time with the right crew, you can have a really fine experience and meet some new people. But it's been quite an adventure, and it can still be one. So I will leave you there. There are, back at the coffee urn, some sample recipes if you want to try to make something like what I call railroad French toast, which is very different from the French toast my mother made. It's bread, but it's got to be a little thicker than usual. It's got to be properly dried out, soaked in a batter, or fried in oil, and then popped in the oven, and it puffs up because of the egg. and then you take it out and you sprinkle powdered sugar on it, and then you put it in front of somebody who's 15 years old and very excited by the whole experience, and he says, "Wow!" and smears orange marmalade all over it. Anyway, so thank you all, and if you have any questions or anything, I'd be glad to hear about it, or if you have any experiences to relate or anything like that.